Well, thank you very much for that flattering introduction. I am so grateful for all the many accolades you heaped upon me, most of which I do not deserve. So I only wish my wife were here to know me to be so well received. And the majestic, beautiful Aquaba, the welcome, I think perhaps, Congressman, you would agree, we open our sessions in Congress with prayer, and everything is better when opened with prayer. But if opened with that music, perhaps we would find more harmony in our own Congress in Washington. So to Dr. Charles Mensa, the founder and chairman of the Institute for Economic Affairs, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for hosting today. Thank you for assembling this remarkable audience. As you went through the introductions, I was more and more and more astonished and impressed, and I kept wondering, who is the keynote speaker today? Who has such wisdom that would draw this audience? And I hope I don't fall short of the expectations generated by such a remarkably esteemed audience. I will say that good governance is the marriage of politics and policy. And you here at IEA are making possible good policy. And it is up to the rest of us to deliver on the good politics. And if we can marry good politics and good policy, then we might have good governance for both of our wonderful countries. Let me not delay any further. I want to introduce to you Congressman Charlie Dent and his wonderful wife, Pamela. Would you just stand for one moment, please? The rest of our delegation is in Cape Coast with our ambassador, with Ambassador Jackson. Because of the party Congress, it was the hope and expectation that not only would they have some wonderful visits with traditional leaders and important historical sites, but that also we would be meeting with the President and ministers in Cape Coast today. He has changed his schedule, and we will be meeting here not long after this address. So much of our delegation was so excited to see historic sites and to meet with traditional leaders that they kept that part of the agenda. But Congressman Dent and I have had a very full, very rich, and very important series of meetings here today, not least of which was beginning the day with worship at Ridge. I have seen very few joint churches that are Anglican and Presbyterian and Methodist in my life. As a Presbyterian, I'll tell you, I think it is a good model and something we might consider following out. A wonderful start to the day in worship. Congressman Dent is a very senior and very influential member of the House of Representatives. He's an appropriator. He has chaired the House Ethics Committee. He is from a district very close to mine. He represents Hershey's, among many other interests that have close connections to Ghana. But one of the things I treasure about having traveled with Congressman and Mrs. Dent, I happen to be a Democrat. He happens to be a Republican. Nonetheless, we are good friends. I trust him. I like him. He is engaging and positive. We can talk to each other honestly. And President Kufuor, you honor us with your presence, but one of the things I noted in the time we had to visit beforehand, even those who at one point may have been on opposite sides of party or of ideology or of a trajectory in history, there's something about the journey. There's something about being with those with whom you've served and with whom you've explored and known the world and with whom you've faced challenges. And Charlie, I'm so grateful for the fact that we get to travel again this year. It was just before our presidential election that my wife and I joined Congressman Dent and his wife, and we went throughout Eastern Europe to a number of countries facing uncertainty about what our presidential election would produce and whether the United States would keep its commitments to NATO and to our Eastern European allies. And we had a number of very difficult conversations, and I'm grateful to have you with me again as we have conversations across 4 countries in the continent. The rest of our delegation includes 2 other senators from Michigan and from Colorado, and members of the House of Representatives from Delaware and from Florida and from California. So we have a robust delegation, and we are very much excited for the opportunity to become better informed about what is going on in the African continent, about our relationships and about our trajectory together. I want to just briefly thank, if I could, the Majority Leader, Kie Mensah Bonsu. Thank you for being with us today. Tini Okaje, great to meet you. Honorable Okudzeto, and Minister Asante, who shared with us some of your long service and your wisdom. I'll tell you briefly, if I could, just to echo some of what Charles said about my first experiences in Kenya. I was an arrogant young man, an American college student, and I thought I knew a lot. And within a matter of days, families with whom I had the honor of staying across Kenya humbly, quietly helped teach me how little I really knew about a very wide range of things. It was my first attempt at milking a cow. It was very unsuccessful. My first attempt at working the ground with a hand hoe, and two girls, one 8 years old and one 10 years old, were much more productive than I was. A number of other experiences, but one that stays with me to this day. I was at a Presbyterian church in Ngong in East Africa. It began with song and some reflection and some prayer, and about an hour into it, there was a spontaneous parade. We all got up and we went out and we walked all the way around the village, and we woke up everyone who wasn't up yet, and anyone who wasn't at church was brought into church and into the second and third hour. And as the sermon began, a woman sitting next to me turned to me and said, "Are you a missionary from your country?" And I said, "Me?" I said, no. You don't need a missionary from where I'm from. My church needs a missionary from here. I've never seen such excitement and passion for service, passion for making a difference, commitment to family and to connectedness and tradition. So if I might just start by that, one of the ways in which Ghana is a model, not just for Africa, but for the world, is in 6 decades of independence. Repeated, multi-party, robust, wide-open elections, and peaceful transitions. One of my own classmates from Amherst College was just re-elected to the presidency of Kenya. And it was an open question whether or not this election would happen peacefully, whether or not it would happen on time. And in a continent, in a world where democracy is under real pressure in so many places and in so many ways, I want to begin by thanking you for being, as a free nation over 6 decades, an exemplar to the world of what repeated elections make possible, and that we together can continue this journey of democracy. Neither of our democracies is perfect. Neither of our democracies has yet fully lived up to the promise of the institutions of democracy, but we can learn a great deal from each other. So let me just say the overarching goals of our delegation are, first, to learn more from you, to ask your input and your advice, and to learn more about the challenges facing West Africa, and in particular Ghana, and to ask what we as representatives of your good friends and partners, the American people, can do together. And we've had a number of meetings just earlier today to look at some of the challenges, for example, of climate change, to look at some of the challenges of changes happening in our world, some of the challenges of drug trafficking, for example, which afflicts both of our countries. Second, we're here to understand Africa's potential and its opportunities. We're here to listen and to find new ways to work together. One member of our delegation has literally never been to Africa before. One member has been to Ghana, I believe, Christy, 11 times? 12 times. This is her 12th visit, so Congresswoman Barbara Lee. So we have members of our delegation who are new to the continent and members who know it far better than I. One other thing I have to correct about the introduction, which was overly generous. Nothing positive has happened in the Congress of the United States with regards to the U.S.-Africa relationship without great partners, without Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate. Perhaps I just am more self-promoting than the others, that you have the mistaken impression that I am the most effective. There are many who have done this work along with me. And as I say, we come from all over the country. There's many different issues on which we disagree. There's other things that divide us in Washington, as you may have picked up in news reports. But we are, all 7 of us, committed to a sustained, deep, and constructive relationship between the United States and Africa. I recognize, Congressman Dent and I recognize, that around the world many are questioning whether or not the United States will sustain its commitments, whether we will continue to meet the commitments that we've made, and whether we will still be the sort of country and the sort of leader we have long been. My principal message to you today is to reaffirm our bipartisan commitment in Congress to a sustained and strong relationship between the United States and Ghana, between the United States and Africa. To clarify that the legislative branch is essential to America's government. It is co-equal with the presidency. All 7 of us were elected before the current president and hope or expect to serve beyond the current president. And we will remain committed to Africa and encourage you to build and maintain partnerships with the Congress and with our executive branch as well. And to give you just a few quick examples, our commitments don't just transcend political parties, they transcend American presidencies. That's why successful initiatives designed to bring our countries together have endured. If you think about it, AGOA, PEPFAR, MCC, Power Africa, Feed the Future, YALI, these are just a few examples, but they are examples of continuity. When we have a new president, a new presidency, there is not a dramatic shift in American policy towards Africa. If anything, president after president has refined and built upon the connections built by their predecessors. It was President Bill Clinton who signed into law the African Growth and Opportunity Act. It was continued and sustained by Presidents Bush and Obama, but it was my friend and partner, Senator Johnny Isakson, who worked along with me in 2015 to extend it by 10 more years, and it was President Obama who signed that extension into law. Why is this important? Because it gives duty-free, quota-free access to the American market, and particularly in apparel for Ghana, but in many other areas. It has allowed for great growth in the U.S.-Africa relationship. AGOA non-energy exports from Africa to the United States under AGOA have grown from just over $1 billion in 2001 to over $4 billion last year, a 4-fold increase in exports to the United States. But there is so much more that we can and should do to strengthen our trading relationships. By one study's account, 300,000 jobs have been created by AGOA's impact in one country alone. President George W. Bush led the creation of the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR. PEPFAR, since 2003, has achieved remarkable results in partnership with African leaders and with African public health professionals. Today, investments by partners, the resilience of the African people, and the generosity of the United States have saved over 12 million lives. And nearly 2 million babies have now been born HIV-free to infected mothers. President Bush also started the Millennium Challenge Corporation, an innovative approach to aid and development which continues to reduce poverty through economic growth in countries across the continent. Ghana has benefited from the MCC now twice. On my first visit here in 2011, I specifically went with Senator Isakson to see some of the positive first fruits of that first compact. That $547 million compact was focused on transportation and agriculture and rural development. And the second, which began in 2014, is focused on electricity. It's a roughly $500 million compact to improve access to electricity. And it's my hope that you will make significant progress in the steps that have to be taken in order for the utility here, the utility sector, to be able to take advantage of this significant commitment of partnership. One of the things I most like about the MCC model is that it begins with what an African nation's own development priorities are. We don't show up and say, these are our development priorities, would you like our money? We show up and say, what are your development priorities? And in a long study process, identify shared priorities and then commit to a 5-year, in this case, nearly $500 million partnership. It's my hope the political will exist to make the hard choices in front of us, to make progress together in providing access to power. President Obama continued this bipartisan legacy with the Power Africa program, which is the principal focus of the second MCC compact. Many of us worked hard together to pass the statute, the Electrify Africa Act, that made that legally possible. Power Africa has the potential to deliver electricity to 50 million Africans. That makes a difference in terms of children studying at home, or cutting-edge hospitals being able to deliver state-of-the-art health care, or manufacturing. If you really want to have one manufacturing plant in every district, there has to be electricity to power those innovative new plants. Feed the Future, another great initiative of President Obama's, is designed to address the root causes of hunger and increase agricultural production. And as I mentioned in my first visit, we got to see, we tasted the best pineapples I've ever had in my life, a truly remarkable advance in agriculture in Ghana. And I think we just had some of those for lunch earlier today, didn't we, Congressman? If we've got most of the arable land on Earth on the continent of Africa, and it is one of the highest employment sectors on the continent, and yet Africa is a net food importer, then something isn't right. And it is to the United States to transfer technology around hybrid seeds, around storage and production and transportation methods, and to work with you in partnership. To the extent there's lessons from our agricultural sector we can share, wonderful. And I think that's essentially what Feed the Future is about. Let me close with one other, a personal favorite, the Young African Leaders Initiative. Last night, our ambassador hosted a reception for quite a few of the Yali Fellows, particularly some who've just returned from this past year. It is an annual program launched by President Obama that brings 500 promising young Africans from a wide range of ages. Young, they're not 18. Some of them are as old as 30. And I've gotten to speak and to meet with them, and the University of Delaware from my home state is one of the host institutions. And a friend of mine, an entrepreneur from Zimbabwe, is starting a program to make it a mutual exchange, where young Americans coming out of college or graduate school come to Africa to learn about business and opportunity here for 6 months, just as 500 young Africans are coming to the United States. That's a program I'm determined to work with President Obama and with friends and partners in the Congress to sustain for the long term, to make sure that it's vibrant and to make sure that we expose the positive side and the real side of the United States to thousands of young African leaders. We don't yet know what the Trump administration's initiatives will be for Africa, but we do know, and I'm here to reassure you, that on a bipartisan basis, we in Congress will continue to sustain these tremendous initiatives that have been launched and built up over many years by presidents, both Republican and Democrat. We recognize that the 54 countries of the continent of Africa have unique histories, cultures, challenges, and opportunities, and we are prepared to partner on a bilateral basis to help address them, to learn more about them, and to make sure that we all have a stronger future together. We know that there are challenges that we face in common. As I mentioned, we visited at Burma Camp the Naval Operations Center and got to see some of what the United States Navy is doing in partnership with the Ghanaian Navy. There are folks who are bringing illicit drugs to the coastline of Ghana, just as they are doing all over the coastline of the United States. This is a scourge that affects all of our communities and people, and to the extent we can share technology and resources and capabilities in the fight against drugs, we welcome the chance to do that. We're aware that some continue to exploit child labor in the cocoa industry and in fishing offshore, and great work has been done to address this challenge. We'll also be visiting a cocoa farm in Cote d'Ivoire and meeting with the First Lady of Cote d'Ivoire. There's more to be done on this. There's been progress. Government efforts have been significant, but more needs to happen to hold perpetrators accountable and to improve our joint fight against trafficking in people. We recognize also that too often corruption has been a challenge in my country and in your country. You mentioned just in passing local office. I spent 10 years in local office in the United States. Today, I'm the ranking Democrat on the Senate Ethics Committee. But I had a hard first decade in local office because I ran against a very powerful and entrenched local elected official who was successful in politics because he didn't play by the rules. He broke some of our laws. He was ultimately investigated and indicted, and I was able to proceed with a cleanup of our police department and of our local electoral system. But these processes only happen when there is an independent judiciary and when there's the courage to move forward with a special prosecutor, something I hope there will be the determination and conviction to do here, just as we are working in a bipartisan way to protect the special prosecutor currently at work in the United States Capitol in an investigation that is very important in our country. Neither country has a perfect democracy, but by traveling together, we can go farther and we can go more surely. We also know that there's tremendous potential all across West Africa, not just, as I mentioned before, in your example as a multi-party democracy, but because of the things that you've done for this region and for the world. As we got to visit your military, both the Navy and Army headquarters earlier today, we were reminded because of a monument to peacekeepers, how much Ghana has contributed to peacekeeping, how much training you provide to other peacekeepers, and the more than 10 UN-sanctioned peacekeeping missions to which Ghanaian military have contributed their time, their effort, their skills, and in many cases even their lives. Your leadership in ECOWAS, in the African Union, in the IEA, is a reminder that Ghana has contributed to building peace, not just in this region, but literally in the world. And there's more that we can and should do together. We've had a number of visits to see on a small level how specific interventions can make a lasting difference. But I just wanted to point to these ways in which your contributions internationally have had a global and a lasting impact. From agriculture to technology, from manufacturing to fashion design to film, we want to build partnerships between American businesses and West African innovators and entrepreneurs that build our nations. We're determined to continue investing in programs like YALI that will train the next generation of leaders, whether to be journalists or entrepreneurs, faith leaders or civic leaders. And we want to make sure that together we have a healthier and more prosperous world. When I was first here in 2011 with my wife, we visited what was then Ridge Hospital. Earlier, we had a chance to visit Accra Regional Hospital and to see what a remarkable change there has already been in what is now a world-class hospital for this entire region. So we have shared goals. We have shared goals to strengthen our democracies, to grow our economies, to have countries that are less corrupt, more efficient, more capable of delivering on the promise that we all care about together. We have a great deal of work to do. I'll remind you that when President Obama became the first sitting president to address the African Union in 2015, he told the gathered heads of state the most urgent task facing Africa today and for decades ahead is to create opportunity for this next generation. I host an annual conference in my little state of Delaware whose title is Opportunity Africa. That is intentional, because every year I have the opportunity to bring ambassadors and heads of state, business leaders, entrepreneurs, figures who are real leaders in Africa to help my constituents understand that Africa is not a continent of famine and disaster. Africa is a continent of immense potential. The 21st century will be an African century. And if the United States can play its role in supporting and strengthening the democracies, economies, and futures of the people of Africa, it would be a great blessing for my people and my country. Thank you for a chance to be with you. I look forward to your questions.
Senator, thank you very much, but we'll open the floor for questions. So we'll just open the floor for questions. Right at the back, there's a gentleman there. Can you come up and...
You were mentioning that the new administration has not really made clear their plans for Africa and Ghana, but you are committed to an extension of such programs. In the last budget statement, it was stated, that's the US budget statement, it was stated that fund to the Africa Development Foundation is proposed to be cut. This is a foundation that is planning to invest some $28 million in businesses across the continent. So how do we juxtapose those two? Thank you.
Than I have, more times than I ever will. He has been to almost every country on the continent. And Senator Inhofe and I disagree on virtually everything. But we agree on the value of the African Development Foundation. And when I went to him and said, are you concerned about this proposal to eliminate this small $28 million foundation, but that is very efficient, provides direct grants, has very little overhead, has positive impact on the ground? He said, absolutely, I want to work tirelessly to support this. He led a letter along with me. We jointly led a letter that got a dozen senators to sign. Tom probably knows exactly how many. A dozen. And that happened quickly, and it happened easily. And Senator Inhofe deserves credit for being the Republican leader on insisting that this foundation be funded and sustained. Now, our appropriations process is not yet complete. A decision on that specific piece will happen in the second week of September once we return to session. But I am optimistic. I am optimistic that the very significant cut in assistance broadly through USAID and the State Department that might have happened that would affect our partnership with Ghana, I believe that will not happen. And I believe that will not happen because of the leadership of Republicans and Democrats on the Appropriations Committee.
I have a question. You gave two examples that really touched me. One is on the strength of institutions so that irrespective of who comes in as president, you're able to carry on some of the mandates across time. The second was your own local experience, running against an elected official who was not doing the right thing. What suggestions do you have for us in terms of strengthening our institutions and making them stronger so that with some of the good ideas that we currently have, we'll be able to carry them on in perpetuity?
How do we continue to build institutions? I'll simply give some reference back to my own circumstances. Because the level of government I was first involved in was fairly small, we represented 500,000 people. It was a county government. The amount of media coverage was not so great. There were only a few radios and newspapers that were covering it, and they were easily misled. Because of the control over the police department that this individual had, and because he was very clever and very determined and very capable and had used public resources to his benefit, he had built up a great series of defensive relationships. It required courage by legislators. It required attention by media to hold him to account. And it required a federal prosecutor who was independent. Only with those three was he called to account. He easily could have avoided accountability. And our institutions, I think our institutions in the United States are fairly deep and fairly strong. At the state level, at the federal level, the independence of our executive, judiciary, and legislative. But they are being tested right now, greatly. And they will be tested in the years ahead. And it requires some folks stepping forward. Right now, there is a special prosecutor named Robert Mueller, who is the former FBI director, who is investigating the President of the United States for obstruction of justice. That is a powerful sentence. And there was grave concern that our president might fire him because of things he was saying. So a Republican senator from the president's party came to me right before we left for the month of August and said, I want to introduce a bill to defend the special prosecutor, to make it much harder for him to be fired, and to give him a judicial avenue for redress in the event of an inappropriate firing. I looked at him and I said, really? That's impressive. Thank you. Would you like to have our lawyers talk about this over the recess? He said, no. We need to introduce this bill now. We sat down and hammered it out and introduced it the next day. It's easy for me to do. It's brave for him to do. And he has attracted public attacks from the president for doing so. All I'm going to say, by way of example, is that in order for democracy to be stronger, occasionally it requires judges and police officers, senators, congressmen, business people, think tank leaders, faith leaders, traditional leaders, to step forward and say, we are stewards of institutions that will live beyond us only if we sacrifice. Only if we sacrifice. Thank you, Eric.
I wanted to ask what the U.S. foreign policy to Africa is, but it's interesting you say you don't know exactly what President Trump's plan for Africa is. But you have talked about continuity across presidencies. President Obama announced that the U.S. government was going to support African countries with about $60 billion US dollars, particularly for our power sector. We've not seen what has become of that. I don't know if you could speak to that very briefly. And I want to ask one other question that is really pressing for me. And that is that what's in aid for Africa to the US? Because certainly you must have had an interest to be coming to Africa to support us in terms of aid. So what's in it for the US when it brings Africa aid, really? What's your interest?
Caleb, thank you for the two-part question. Perhaps I misunderstood your first question, but let me just restate, and I don't mean to be too forward in saying so, but you asked what has become of the promise of assistance for the power sector for Africa. There is this Millennium Challenge Compact of $500 million between the United States and Ghana that is focused on power generation, where Power Africa is the initiative that is facilitating the changes and the connections and the opportunities that are at the center of that compact. So whether $60 billion will ultimately be realized or not isn't in the hands of one president. It's in the hands of several Congresses. But we have passed the statute, the Electrify Africa Act. We are continuing to deliver on the projects, and there are power plants and projects being built in more than a dozen countries. We actually had a detailed briefing on it. Was that earlier today or yesterday? My sense of time is terrible. I think it was early. It was this morning. So we had a detailed briefing this morning on a number of different projects to help address Ghana's power constraints and power challenges. And as I referenced, we're at a point where reform in the utility sector is essential to attract more investment. Ghana has an unusual problem in having more capacity more generating capacity than power is actually being delivered. And I don't think I understood until this morning the ways in which climate change is reducing the generating capacity of your hydropower assets, which are impressive. There's a lot of work to do together in continuing to deliver on Power Africa and the promise of Electrify Africa. But if there's any country where I expected to be asked what's happened, it wasn't a country where $500 million has been committed. What is in it for the United States? That's your larger question. Well, first, we spend less than 1% of our total federal budget on foreign assistance. We spend less than 1% of our federal budget on foreign assistance. And the top 5 countries that receive foreign assistance from the United States are not in Africa. They're countries where we have long-standing strategic relationships. Countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Egypt, and Israel. But if you look at the next 10 countries in terms of receipt of assistance, they're virtually all in Africa. So why do we spend hundreds of millions of dollars with Ghana? Why wouldn't we? You are a democracy. You are a stable country. You contribute to peacekeeping. You contribute to the international order. It is in our interest and your interest. Ghanaians are the second largest group of African university students in the United States after Nigerians. There are incredibly close ties between Ghana and the United States. At church this morning, 3 different people came up to me and said, "Oh, I just came back from the United States. I was visiting my son who's at school, or I was visiting my cousin who is running a small business, or I have a house in, So I think our relationships between Ghana and the United States are close and long and positive. We sell more products to Ghana, including chicken from my home state, our very good export. I hope you love Delaware chicken. We export a lot of our products to Ghana, but that's not the reason to do it. The reason to do it has to do with our shared values. There's a whole lot of Ghanaian cocoa that ends up in Hershey's that his home district purchases, and there's a whole lot of chicken from my state that you purchase. Our world is stronger when we are woven together in a network of shared values. And a country that is multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multilingual, multi-party, and yet a stable democracy, what a great partner for the journey ahead.
And I find it very, very strange that the BWIs usually are in support of peasant farming as against commercial farming. When they want to support our systems in Africa, they are more supporting of the peasantry type of farming, which is quite primitive. When we want to put up commercial farming claims, we don't get that much support. That's one. And secondly, we also have a challenge in the deep-seated suspicion of what I think could actually get us to live in agriculture, and that is the GM foods or GM seeds. How do we work together to remove that deep-seated suspicion about GM? Because I think it is the future of modernizing agriculture. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope I understood your whole question, and if not, please correct me. There's another small startup company in Delaware. It's called DuPont. You may have heard of DuPont. It's 200 and some years old. In the neighborhood, the little village that I grew up in, almost all the adults worked for DuPont. DuPont today is a much smaller business in my state than it was when I was young, and it has grown dramatically in the rest of the world. When I meet with the CEO of DuPont, Africa is the place they are most excited about for seeds and hybrid seeds and seed development. I have visited agricultural stations in Ethiopia and in Kenya and in South Africa where DuPont is investing significant amounts, where African agronomists and African agricultural scientists, not Americans, are developing new hybrids that are specific for some of the climates that are more African. A hybrid seed that works in Nebraska isn't going to work in the Rift Valley, isn't going to work, outside of Kumasi. It's going to work in Nebraska. That's what it's designed for. On the question of commercial farming versus smallholder farming, the number of Africans employed in farming suggests that a hybrid form of farming may be best. That's for you to say, not me. But the United States has enormous flat level plains in the center of it. It's literally the bottom of an ancient sea that is very deep in soil and is very, very flat. And so we developed a form of agriculture that is highly mechanized, where the typical farm is 10,000 or 20,000 acres, and where there's very few people working. It's mostly machines. I don't know if that's really the right answer for Africa. We have very capital-intensive farming. We put a lot of irrigation and fertilizer and GM seeds and heavy equipment into our high-production corporate agriculture. I do think the yields in much of Africa are unchanged since Roman times, and we have to work together on that. And that is what Feed the Future is principally focused on. DuPont is delivering threefold increases in yield for Ethiopian farmers in the highlands with a new hybrid that is specifically designed for the Ethiopian highlands, which has an unusual mix of lots of water, different types and timing in terms of water and soil. Anyway, GM. I trained as a chemist as an undergraduate. I actually believe in science. There is no demonstrated evidence that genetically modified crops harm human health. Most of us have consumed GM food for 25 or 30 years. This is a subject of hot debate in the United States. I have members of my community, even my family, who believe differently than I do. I say to them, show me the scientific evidence. Our public health regulatory agencies approve the use of genetically modified crops that have very high yield and perform extremely well. But it is the subject of some dispute. I recognize that. I do think that ultimately that is what will produce the yields required to feed a hungry continent and a hungry world. But that is a decision to be made by the elected leaders of African nations, not by American companies. We should present you the evidence and present you the options, and you make the decision. But I think it should be a decision based on science, not based on fear. But I recognize when it comes to what we feed our children, it's understandable for parents to hesitate and to insist on evidence. There are many ways, can I talk 2 more minutes in response to this? There are many ways that the United States developed its agricultural potential 100 years ago that also reinforced democracy. And I just want to mention 2 of them. Farm cooperatives, credit cooperatives, and electrical cooperatives. The southern third of my state was only electrified in the 1930s. And the federal government played a small role in it. But the Delaware Rural Electric Cooperative is what delivers electrical generation and distribution lines and connectivity and support for irrigation to our farmers in a part of our state that our public utility, that is a profitable utility, wasn't interested in. And it's democratic. It is a collective. I just went to their annual meeting last week. There are 5,000 farmers that control this electric utility. And it has helped reinforce the mechanisms of democracy at a local level. In terms of access to credit, to being able to borrow money season to season, and to be able to get crop insurance, we also used a cooperative model in much of the United States, very locally controlled. But in many states in the 1910, 20, 30 period, farm co-ops is how farmers were able to get access to the money needed to purchase a tractor or to purchase new hybrid seeds. And both of these organizations in the United States are happy to talk about their experience and how it both led to better development and sustained democracy at the local level in the United States. I think that's a story that is not well known outside our country. If you just look at the modern American farm, it seems as if it was built by some huge multinational company. It was built slowly and from the bottom up, and it was built by farmers and farmer communities in a cooperative way. I appreciate your question. I hope I answered it. Thank you.
With all these initiatives, is there anything directed at the strong, determined African woman and Ghanaian woman, who, by the way, outnumber the men, not represented here today? As is our story all the time. Is there anything that is targeted at us? Because we have heard that there have been cuts to little grants and funding to women's programs and initiatives that previously used to come to us.
Bridget, thank you for the question, for your service and your leadership. I'll tell you a brief story, if I might. My daughter, who's now 16, 4 years ago was selling Girl Scout cookies. Are you familiar with Girl Scouts? One of the ways that young women in America learn business skills and entrepreneurship is by literally going house to house and selling cookies that are made by this national organization, the Girl Scouts. And she was exceptionally good at selling Girl Scout cookies. She set a record for her troop. And the next year she comes to me and she says, I have discovered that the palm oil in these cookies is not sustainable. It's destroying the environment in Indonesia and leading to the death of orangutans. I refuse to sell more Girl Scout cookies until there is sustainable palm oil, preferably generated by a women's cooperative. And fortunately, less than a year later, I was able to show her a photograph of me with Bono at a women's cooperative making palm oil in Liberia. So some small progress has been made in that regards, but I'd be interested in hearing about your work around palm oil. Palm oil, you know, I don't mean to make any joke of it. The cultivation of palm oil in some parts of the world has led to significant environmental degradation. And it's an important component in food and fuel and used in many ways around the world. And it's important that we find sustainable ways for its harvesting. There are reports of programs such as Let Girls Learn by the former First Lady, a program run by a personal friend of mine. There are some reports that programming is being cut or is being eliminated. Remember, as Congressman Dent says, the president proposes, but Congress disposes. We make the decisions. And if you haven't met Mrs. Dent, you don't know what a real woman leader looks like. In the Dent household, as in my household, my wife was also active in politics locally before I was, and is a strong and capable voice. We know that we're outnumbered, and we respect you for what you've done. Let me just say, in 54 countries, there have been two women presidents. I was honored to be able to be at President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's second inaugural with our Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton. You know, I'm a Democrat. I was disappointed in the outcome of the last election. But I respect the electoral process, and I will continue to work with my friends, Republicans and Democrats, to find ways that we can work together to support education, entrepreneurship, independence for women around the world as well as in the United States. I think we shouldn't confuse the outcome of one presidential election with a change in values and direction by the American people. There are as many Republicans as Democrats in America who are passionate leaders. There are more women in the United States Senate today by 2 to 1 than there were when I started. And my immediate next door neighbor is Senator Joni Ernst, who is a very capable, very tough senator recently elected from Iowa. So I think the future for women and women in leadership in America is bright, and I think the future for our continued investment in women's programs here and around the world is strong as well. Last footnote, my friend who ran that program for Michelle Obama just announced 2 weeks ago she's running for governor of Maryland. So she will have a next chapter as well.
Thank you, Chairman. And let me also add my voice commend Senator Coons for your insights and perspectives on Africa. In Ghana, we've, since entering the Fourth Republic, had 7 elections that have produced 4 different administrations. Of course, the harvest has been divided by two main political parties, the NDC and the MPP. Senator, the preamble of our constitution provides that Ghanaians have agreed to establish a framework of governance that would secure for ourselves and posterity the blessings of liberty, equality of opportunity, and prosperity. Unfortunately, we must add that we are not out of the woods yet. The dividends of democratic governance should find expression in qualitative improvement in the living standards of the people that the government governs. Unfortunately, we're still saddled with some problems relating, as a colleague just said on the floor, to the basics of life: food security, clothing, shelter, and sometimes they are difficult. But yes, government is making progress. We think that maybe we could have made giant strides than we have done, which is why we require these partnerships that you are talking about. I agree with the suggestion from the floor that we need really to strengthen the institutions of governance, especially from where I am coming, Parliament. Because if Parliament is strong, a lot of things could be achieved. Oftentimes, we are not in a position to put the executive in check, much as we would want to do. And of course, some of the problems are constitutional, some are self-inflicted by our own rules of procedure and so on. We are tackling them, and I believe that in the fullness of time, we'll be able to get somewhere. But let me assure that in Ghana today, we do not have any extreme political parties. By the construct of our constitution, all parties are consigned to the center. We're all centrist parties, in spite of the the noise. Somebody has supplied the word. In spite of the noise, my party belongs just a little bit to the right of the center. The NDC belongs to a little bit to the left of the center. And I believe the CPP as well. Because the agenda for national development and the ideology of this country is established by the directive principle of state policy. So we can't really do much and go wayward of the established dictate of the Constitution, which is why perhaps we need to strengthen the National Development Planning Commission, because they will have to extract and construct the way for our national development, so that the various political parties, given the fact that we are all centrist parties, will weave our development agenda, our manifestos, around what is established by the National Development Planning Commission. So I would assure that any partnership that you build with Ghana will be long-lasting, because parties are enjoined to follow and indeed continue to the largest extent possible programs, policies, and projects begun by their predecessor administrations. So we thank you, and we hope that we continue to build the partnerships, cooperation, collaboration that is required to improve on the quality of life of our peoples. Thank you once again.
The reasons you were initially known to the world. It's clear to me that the gold in Ghana is not gold in the ground. It's gold in your hearts, it's gold in your faith, it's gold in your families. And it's important we all remember that when first pulled from the ground, gold is not that beautiful. It must be refined. You must remove the dross. You must find a way through the refiner's fire to purify. We are both on a journey together to strengthening our systems, to making ourselves more committed to fighting corruption, to ensuring that no child is sold into servitude, to make certain that women have their leadership role they're rightly designed for in our societies, and that we can sustain our commitment to each other over generations. You have an enormous gift for the people of the United States. It's not material gold, it's spiritual gold. And I'm grateful for the chance to be with you today. Thank you.